to the Australian Hiker Podcast, Australia's longest-running hiking podcast, downloaded over 1 million times worldwide and providing you with an Australian perspective on all things hiking. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country.
In this week's episode 307, we talk about hiking in Timor Leste, a location often not discussed. We hope you enjoy. If you'd like to help support Australian Hiker and this podcast, there are a couple of ways that you can help us out. Firstly, by subscribing on your podcast host of choice so that each episode is available as soon as it's published. And if you have the opportunity, leave us a 5-star review. Another way to support us is go to the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au and click on the Support Us page and buy us a coffee. You can do a one-off donation or become a monthly supporter. All donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue producing this podcast and blog. Now let's get on to today's episode. Ask just about any hiker to name an overseas hiking destination, and Timor Leste is unlikely to be in that list. In fact, most people would probably struggle to place Timor Leste on the world map. In this week's episode, we catch up with Jonty Crane to find out what's so special about hiking in Timor Leste and to find out what we've been missing out on. Just as a heads up, if you go to the show notes for this podcast, we'll have the links we discussed and mentioned during the interview, as well as links to Jonty's website with some great photos on it to provide a bit more detail. So, Jonty, thanks for taking the time to chat with us about hiking in Timor Leste.
My pleasure.
Now, before we talk about Timor Leste itself, please tell us a bit about yourself, your general background and your hike resume.
Yeah, so as the accent may suggest, I am from the UK originally, but I moved to New Zealand in 2010. Project management, so kind of office-based job, but I have done a lot of travels, increasingly more travel, and to more kind of offbeat places like Pakistan, Syria and Iran and Papua New Guinea. So I've been writing a travel blog for the last kind of 10 years or so at jontytravels.com. And then in terms of hiking, so I didn't get into hiking until I moved to New Zealand, and it seemed the thing to do. So I started with the Great Walks and kind of took it from there. So I've done, I think, 36 multi-day hikes in New Zealand, which I think is, I've hiked on 5 continents now. And I kind of figure that if you can hike in New Zealand, you can hike pretty much anywhere because there's few places with as many tree routes, as mud, as variable weather. You're carrying all your gear. Hiking in Europe is just so easy. Well, physically it can be quite hard, but in terms of navigation and track conditions, it can be a lot easier. So that's been really good kind of preparation for hiking. I've done a little bit in Australia. So I did the Larapinta Trail a few years ago, which I love. That was just complete contrast from Australia. I've done a bit of hiking in Africa. So I went to the Rwenzori, which is in Uganda, and that's home to the 3rd highest peak in Africa. And that was, you would not believe the amount of mud. Like I hiked in gumboots. It's the only hike I've ever done in gumboots, and you need a gumboot. Like the hiking boots and gaiters would not be enough. You were basically hiking through swamps for large parts of it. And that really was an amazing trip, but also confirmed that I'm not a mountaineer. So it was pretty high mountain, and we're up there, and I've got the ropes, and we're going across glaciers with crampons, and about 4,500 meters or something, and it was like, this is too scary for me. I love the hiking. Mountaineering's a little bit too much. But I have done a couple of big trips in the Himalaya. So I did the Snowman Trek, which is in Bhutan, which is the best part of a month, very, very remote hike. That was amazing. And also the Kanchenjunga circuit. So that's the 3rd highest mountain in the world in far kind of east Nepal, but on the border between Nepal and India. So that was quite an experience as well. So I love the hiking, and I love the variety. So like doing the Kokoda Track in Papua New Guinea, or doing Himalaya, or doing Africa. So I'm very keen on getting variety.
Okay, no, that's good. And I was going to say, the Snowman Track, you didn't have any mud there at all?
It's funny because it has a nickname as being the Mudman Trek, but there was a few days with a bit of mud, but compared to some of the tramps I've done in New Zealand, down Stewart Island, or particularly this one in Africa in the Rwenzori, that was next level mud. Like that was, mud up to your knees. You literally probably drown in the mud if you weren't careful. So, there was a few bad days in Snowman, but overall I thought it didn't live up to its reputation.
When we did Bhutan, we did the layer to Gasa track, and the guide had just come off the snowman track just the week before, and they said pretty much it rained the entire trip and it was muddy the entire trip. So it sounds like you got a good run on that one.
Thankfully, the challenge with the snowman is there's a very short window between the monsoon finishing and the snow falling, and it's like a 3-4 week hike, so you have to kind of do it at the back end of the monsoon season. So invariably the first week or so is overcast and raining, and then hopefully the weather gets good, and then hopefully you get out before the snow falls and the path is closed. No,
that's good. Okay, so let's talk about Timor Leste. And as I mentioned in the introduction, most people in Australia, you know, if you say name a hiking track overseas that you know of, Timor Leste is unlikely to be in that list. And I did say in the introduction that most people would be hard pressed to place Timor Leste on a map. They know it's somewhere north of Australia, but that's probably about as good as most people's geography goes. How did you actually end up in Timor Leste to start with?
So I'm volunteering here. So we have in New Zealand, there's an organisation, an NGO called Volunteer Service Abroad. ABI is the Australian equivalent, and then the Peace Corps in America, and then Japan and Korea have kind of similar sort of setups. They differ in the details, but effectively they're NGOs that help Westerners to go and volunteer in countries that need support. So VSA operate basically across the Pacific, so they're in Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon, Vanuatu, and Timor-Leste is the only kind of non-Pacific country, because it's a funny one. It is Southeast Asia, but because of its size, it often, like in UN forums, it kind of relates a bit more to the Pacific. It's got more in common with small Pacific countries than it does, say, with Malaysia or Singapore, in Southeast Asia. So I came out to volunteer. It was something that I had sort of thought about. I'm kind of middle-aged, and I thought I could have a bit of a change in life. Both the opportunity to kind of give back some of my skills and experience, and also just to have a great kind of experience myself. My partner and I, we came out to Timor-Leste in February last year, nearly a year ago. And my partner's been volunteering at Oxfam, involved in climate change. And then I've been volunteering with Hamnasa, which is a local Timorese NGO that does kind of community engagement. And also I've been doing some volunteering with the Ministry of Tourism to try and promote Timor-Leste as a travel destination. Because as you say, most people have not heard of it. And if they have heard of it, they know nothing about it. Or if they have heard of it and know something about it, they probably think it's called East Timor, which was what it was called pre-independence in 2002.
Yep.
And they probably know it from the conflict with Indonesia over the last kind of had quite a torturous history to get to this point. And then location-wise, it's about an hour north of Darwin, so it's probably the closest country to Australia, but it's just an hour's flight north of Darwin.
Okay, so apart from helping to promote tourism on the island itself, you're obviously looking for a hobby and something to do in your downtime over there, and hiking, which is something you're interested in. So it's probably a good match. I must admit, any time I visit a new place or a new country, I always go for a walk, and I think I'd probably do exactly the same thing that you've done as well.
Yeah, hiking is one of my big things. And I think one of the things, that's what I've found is, you really get to see a place on foot, and so I've done a lot of hiking, but I've also been doing quite a lot of just even city walks. So one of my little goals before I leave next month is to walk every neighbourhood in Dili, the capital city where I live. And so every morning I go out and I use Strava and then stick it into a Google map, and then I can see where I've walked and where I haven't walked and where the gaps are, and it's just been a really amazing experience just exploring the city on foot. Really, really love that.
Okay. A bit of urban hiking, particularly in a foreign country, is a good idea.
Yeah.
Now, apart from that, give us a bit more of an indication of what Timor is like. So what's it like as a country, the terrain and the culture and the environment?
Yeah, so Timor-Leste is half of the island of Timor, which is at the end of the Indonesian chain of kind of islands. So you've got kind of Java and Bali and Lombok, etc. So Timor-Leste is down on the sort of far eastern end. It is the smallest and by some margin the poorest country in Southeast Asia, and it is also the least visited country in Southeast Asia, and it's one of the least visited countries in the world. They get maybe around 25,000 tourists a year. In comparison, Bali Airport gets 23 million tourists a year. I went to Indonesia and Bali over Christmas, and it's completely the opposite end in terms of tourism. This is very much kind of under tourism. So the country, the landmass itself, is very mountainous. I think over half the land in Timor Leste is at a 40-degree angle or greater, so it's very mountainous. The highest peak is nearly 3,000 meters above sea level, and there's quite a range of kind of terrain across the kind of country. And so that was actually that played in, just to give a bit about the history around Timor Leste. So Timor Leste was colonized by the Portuguese in 17th century, and they stayed for hundreds of years, and they basically came for sandalwood. And then they chopped down all the sandalwood in the entire country, so there was none left, but that was the main reason for it being a Portuguese colony. They had lots of fights with the Dutch, because obviously the Dutch had kind of the Indonesian part. And then during the Second World War, the Japanese invaded and kind of occupied the country for a few years. Japanese left, Portuguese returned, and then after the revolution in Portugal in 1975, they decided to leave then East Timor, and Timorese were very excited about getting independence, which lasted about 10 days, and then the Indonesian army invaded. And so their tanks and troops rolled in 1975. Balabo 5 people may have heard of in Australia, so that was 5 Australian-based journalists, or a mixture of New Zealand Kiwis and Aussies, who were basically murdered by the Indonesian army because they were reporting on the news. Indonesia had a pretty brutal occupation. Like, the estimates vary, but at a minimum, hundreds of thousands of Timorese died out of a population of less than 1 million at the time. So it was pretty brutal, tough times. Eventually, in 1999, particularly with the fall of the Indonesian dictator post the kind of 1997 financial crisis, they held a referendum, and the Indonesians basically left Timor-Leste, and then they basically destroyed everything when they left. So something like 80% of the buildings in the country were destroyed, all the power system was destroyed. It was very much a scorched earth kind of approach, and the Indonesians left, and then Timorese had their own country as of 2002. So it's a young country, 23 years old. It's got a young population. The average age is probably 18, 19, 20. There's a lot of children around, a lot of young people. Interesting from an economy perspective. So they're the most oil and gas dependent economy in the world. You kind of think of countries in the Middle East, but Timor-Leste, basically the entire government, everything that the government does is paid for through the oil and gas revenues, which is shared between, a lot of it is shared between Australia and Timor. So the island itself, it's about a fifth of the size of Tasmania. So it's not that large, but it is got a surprising amount of variety, and it would probably take about 10 hours to drive from kind of one end to the other, because the road infrastructure is not great. So I've actually been quite amazed. Like, I've been here a year. I've done, I think, about 35 multi-day trips outside of Dili, the capital, and I've seen a lot of the country, but there is a lot to see. So it is a very kind of varied. That's probably quite a long answer to your question.
No, that's fine. My only background on Timor-Leste is really, from, as you say, from the occupation and then the independence, but no idea about the island itself. So it's good to find out.
It's also interesting, the second most Catholic country in the world.
Okay.
So the most Catholic country is the Vatican City, which you'd kind of expect, but something like 97, 98% of the population are Catholic. And that's interesting because that only came about because of the Indonesian occupation. So despite 400 years of Portuguese rule, Portuguese Catholic, I don't know, something like 50 or 60% of the population were Catholic when the Portuguese left. But then when the Indonesians invaded, they basically said, you have to pick a religion. Like, that's the way it kind of works in Indonesia. You can be Catholic, you can be Muslim, you can be Hindu, there's a list. And Timorese didn't want to be Muslim because that was the religion of the occupier. There's no sort of history of Hinduism or Buddhism here. And so they all converted to Catholicism. And the role of the Catholic Church in the occupation was similar to like the Catholic Church in Poland during communism. So they were really seen as the only real Timorese as opposed to being part of the occupiers. So that actually Catholicism has been a real boom industry in Timor Leste. It was recognised by the Pope visiting last year. And certainly when you go hiking and especially city exploring, every neighbourhood will have little shrines. I went for a walk this week and I walked past 5 chapels. Like there are signs of Catholicism everywhere, and that's quite interesting kind of culturally to add to the kind of the normal kind of hiking experience.
Now, tell us a bit about the hiking in Timor-Leste. What are the hiking options? I mean, it sounds like you've done multi-day stuff, but is there multi-day, overnight sort of trips, or paint us a picture of the hiking?
Pretty much everything is possible. I've done over 65 day hikes, generally 2 to 3 hours rather than kind of full day, just because of the climate, which we'll come on to no doubt. And then I've done 4 multi-day hikes. So I did an 8-day hike across the entire country from coast to coast, from the north coast to south coast. That was pretty epic. And then I've done 3 to 4 day hikes as well. So there are definitely options. Basically, there are tracks and trails across the entire country because that is how the locals get around. Like I've been to quite a lot of places which are only accessible by foot. And the way it normally starts, and I've seen this a lot like in the Himalaya, it's a walking track and then it gets expanded a little bit and then you get a motorbike along it, and then at some point there might be a dirt road and at some point that might be sealed. That kind of process is a bit further behind lots of other countries. So there are endless paths and tracks everywhere.
So I was going to say the tracks themselves, are they actually marked hiking trails, or you're using local transport trails?
Local transport trails. There is literally zero hiking infrastructure in the entire country. So there is no signage. There are no maps, or there has been until that's one of the things I've been doing over the last year is trying to map out the trails. There have been some on Wikiloc and on All Trails and Strava. There are a few things on there that people have uploaded, but there's not really any like official kind of hiking maps. I've come across maybe 2 or 3 kind of campsites, which aren't campsites like an Australian style campsite, but it's kind of people who've set something up in their back garden kind of as a camping setup. So it is frontier hiking. You want to have a certain level of experience to do some of the bigger hikes here, but that basically means, if you, especially multi-day, you can't do those without support. So you need support, and we can talk a bit about that. When it comes to day hikes, like in Dili, where I've done a lot of my hikes, which is the capital city and where I live, it is definitely possible, but it's good to build up a bit of experience. So I remember when I first arrived here last year, I was a bit overwhelmed, to be honest. The climate, the culture, the language. Like some English is spoken, some Portuguese is spoken, but it's pretty limited. And as soon as you get out of the cities, nobody speaks any English. Pretty much every house will have a dog, just kind of protecting their patch. But I mean, I've got a strong phobia against dogs, and so it's taken me a bit of a while to adjust to that. Again, like as long as you've got hiking poles, you're fine, or pick up a stone or something. Like it's all manageable, but there's certainly, I found, a bit of a learning curve to building up confidence of exploring the city. So when I first arrived, there is actually a hiking group called the Dili Saturday Walkers. They've got a Facebook group, and they meet every Saturday and go for a walk in the morning. And that's been a really good way as like an introduction to doing this, because you're doing it in a group of 15, 20 people, and you've got a leader who knows where they're going, hopefully. And then it was amazing, because when I first arrived, I was kind of terrified of everything. And then like yesterday, I just went for a hike in the hills. Like I went on Google Earth and I just saw, there's a trail going up this ridge line. It goes along this other ridge and we have to come down this other side. And I just wandered out into the hills and mapped out a trail, and I'm quite comfortable doing that now. But it's definitely, it's been a learning curve to get to that point. But when I talk about some of the hikes later on, I mean, I'll be choosing the ones which are a bit more accessible. But certainly, if you're in for an adventure, this is a great place to come. If you enjoyed the Kokoda track, this is a great place to come. I guess if you hike in Australia regularly, you will be more accustomed to the heat and maybe the humidity, so that's a bonus to hiking in Timor. But certainly, there's no kind of infrastructure that you would have on the Larapinta or some of the great walks in New Zealand. But then there is no tourists. Like when I go hiking, I do not see any. They call them Malay. So the local word for foreigner is Malay, and I have never seen any other Malay hiking. And I think I've probably hiked more Timor Leste than any other, well, probably up there in terms of Malay who have actually explored this country.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that you looked on Google Maps. What is the internet and the phone system like up there? Can an Australian take a mobile phone and, providing they've got roaming, get signal, or is it a bit patchy?
Then it depends probably on your operator and whether they've got a partner in Timor. There's 3 mobile phone operators here, or get a local SIM. So I think eSIMs are possible, but they can be a bit expensive. It's better just to get a local SIM when you arrive. And they've got 3 network providers. I mean, coverage in Dili is fine. The speed is. There was a survey that came out and it said that Timor-Leste had the 4th slowest internet in the world. I think it was only Afghanistan, Yemen, and Syria had slower internet. So it is quite slow. It's very much kind of 4G rather than F5 or 5G, or even 3G often. And then the coverage does tend to drop out when you get out into the country. So I mean, there's no Wi-Fi. This doesn't really exist. Starlink has just been approved, so that's going to hopefully going to make a difference. And the issue was it's one of the few countries in the world which has no fibre optic cables into the country. So all the internet comes through satellite. But they are installing a new cable which will be installed this year, so that will hopefully increase the speed. But especially if you're going to, you've marked out your route on a map, make sure you've got it available in offline mode when you're out and about. But if you do have any issues, like the locals are very, very, very welcoming and friendly, and it's such a novelty still. It's one of probably few places in the world where it's a novelty to see tourists and foreigners, and they will definitely try and help you out. They've all been very, very welcoming. You often hear the word Malay. When I go for a hike, I get the word Malay shouted at me maybe 50 or 100 times, particularly the kids. Like, it's such a, this white person walking past the house, it's like, Malay, and they'll be like, photo, selfie. And so they're very inquisitive. And, belay is a very useful word to me to use. Belay means like, may I or can I? So I'm like, can I go this way? Belay, and just a bit of pointing generally kind of works out. So very helpful, but there's not that kind of formal infrastructure. You're not going to get the map on your phone and just follow yourself around necessarily. You do need to use a bit of initiative.
Do you use GPS at all up there, or it's pretty much map systems, offline map systems on your phone?
Yeah, I do everything on my phone basically. Yeah, so if I know I'm going to have signal, like I'm walking around Dili, I'll use Strava. If I'm outside of Dili, basically, I use an app called Map Out, and that I can just plot my routes on there. It helps. Yeah, either basically you want to go with a local operator or go with the Dili Saturday Walkers group. And I have written a book called Exploring Timor Leste on Foot, which is available on Amazon as an ebook, as a print book. And so in there, I've listed out kind of 30 hikes around the country that one can do. Particularly though, when you get to Dili day walks is fine. I think if you get the map, you're fine. When you start getting out further into the country, local guides are very helpful. So all the kind of summits I've done, so like Mataviem, which is the second highest peak, you go with a local guide. They're probably the son of a farmer. They probably don't speak any English. They'll have a machete just because you need a machete to get through some of the tracks, and they will take you up and down for anywhere between $10 and $25 for the hike. So that's really kind of recommended. It's unless you're very confident, get a guide. Otherwise, it's easy to get lost.
All right. Now, it sounds like the terrain's quite variable. So, is there a range of hikes? So, you're doing summit hikes, you're doing jungles and open grasslands and beach walking, or what's the mix of hiking environments?
Basically, everything is possible. So it's an island, so you've got there's some beautiful coastline. There are some nice coastal walks, which obviously navigation, they're very easy as long as you get the tides right. One of the most popular, or relatively most popular spots to visit in Timor-Leste is Atau Island, which is about an hour and a half ferry ride from Dili. So it's very easy to get to, and it's a beautiful island. There's world-class snorkeling, diving, really spectacular reefs. And there's also very good hiking discovered. So you can do the hiking basically up into the hills and over, but you can also hike around the coast. And they've got quite a variety of beaches. You've got kind of sandy, and then there's one sort of white sand beach. Then you've got kind of real rocky beaches. So there's quite a kind of variety of kind of coastal walking opportunities. Most of the hikes I do are up into the hills, so up around Dili, which is quite similar to Australia in terms of very kind of red soils, lots of eucalyptus trees. And then you go into, when you get into kind of the interior of the country, there's basically a mountain range that kind of runs along the spine of the country. So Mount Ramelau is the highest point, just under 3,000 meters. So and there's Mattabien, the second highest peak. So there's kind of a handful of half a dozen or so kind of peaks that you can do if you like kind of going up peaks. None of them, Mount Kablaki is probably that's the fourth highest. That's the most challenging, and that's quite terrifying to be honest, but it's not mountaineering. Like, they're all hiking peaks, and actually the highest one, Ramelau, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail later, is very much it's a straightforward kind of path. It requires a bit of effort to get up the hill, but you don't need any kind of technical skills to hike it. Tree routes, for some reason, don't really seem to be a thing here. The tracks are more likely to be a bit rocky. The soil's kind of maybe a bit clayey. It can be a bit slippery on some of the descents. Hiking poles, highly recommend hiking poles, because they're kind of local trails. They're not kind of, 5 foot wide graded paths with water runoffs at the side. They're not the sort of standard that you might see on trails in New Zealand and Australia. So after it rains, it can get a bit muddy, it can get a bit slippery. There's basically 2 seasons in Timor Leste. So the climate is, if anybody lives in the Northern Territory, they'll be kind of familiar with it. So you kind of get you get your dry season, you get your wet season. So dry season's from kind of May to November, and it rains maybe half a dozen times in 6 months. It's pretty reliable in terms of the weather. And the downside is the landscape at the beginning of the dry season is fine, but by the end of the dry season, it's very dusty and barren. I mean, it's interesting, but it is quite it's quite a different contrast. And now, and we're recording this in the wet season, which is kind of December through to kind of April, May time. And then it will rain most days, generally at the end of the afternoon. But the landscape, like when I went for a walk yesterday, I hadn't been for a big hike for about a month, and the contrast was just night and day. Like, everything is green, everything is growing. Some of the tracks that were quite obvious are now a bit overgrown, so that's another challenge. But so you need to think about when you want to come out, you want to go hiking. Probably, I'd say June, July is probably the best time, because it's dry season, but you've still got the kind of lush landscape from the wet season.
What are the temperatures like, sort of daytime and nighttime temperatures during the dry season?
So actually, the temperature is the same all year round, and the humidity goes up a little bit, but it's pretty consistent. It's really just the amount of rainfall is the only variable. So during the daytime, you're looking at kind of low to mid 30s. That in Dili, and around the coast in Dili, kind of at sea level, that's the kind of temperatures. And at night, you're probably looking at between 22 and 24 degrees. So it is quite a warm place. I think the humidity is about 5% lower than Singapore. So Singapore is really humid. This is also very humid. It's a bit better in the dry season in terms of humidity. When you get up into the hills, so I've only been cold, I'd say, once in a year, which, given I live in Wellington in New Zealand, is quite a novelty to not be cold. And so the only time I've actually felt physically quite cold in Timor Leste was at the summit of Mount Ramelau, which is the highest point in the country, around sunset, and I had the down jacket and the windbreaker on, and mainly because it's very windy up there.
Yeah.
And so that same time felt physically cold. So even, to be honest, when I've been hiking up, say, Mattabien, which is about 2,300 meters, it's still quite hot. Like, you can be quite high up in the mountains, and it's still pretty hot. So you just need to start early. You start around 6:30, 7 a.m. When the light comes up, and then you want to try and get most of your hiking, especially the hills, done in the morning. And then just be very conscious around kind of any first signs of heat stroke. So try and get some shade if you can. I found an umbrella very useful when there's no kind of natural shade available. I always carry hydrolytes. So if you get a dodgy stomach, you have hydrolytes, but they're fantastic for rehydration. So having one or two of those after you, when you stop, is a really good idea. Take lots of water. There's not a lot of water supplies. Like, it's surprisingly, for the amount of rain, there's surprisingly few flowing rivers and surprisingly few lakes. So you generally want to be taking all the water you need for the day with you in the morning, because being able to find supplies on the way is probably unlikely to happen. And yes, sun, hat, and just the usual, just easy common sense really around the heat and humidity. But if you're not used to it, it's worth taking a couple of days to acclimatise.
Now, getting onto the hikes themselves, what are your 3 or 4 top hikes and why?
So I've chosen 3 to give quite a contrast of the kind of options available, and I've also chosen the 3 of the ones which are more straightforward to do. So I've got a book, Exploring Timor Leste on Foot, which has got 30 hikes out of the 65 I've done, so I have prioritised a little bit, but these 3 are definitely 3 of the most accessible. So the first one is an easy walk, easy flat walk in Dili. The second one is going to the summit of Mount Ramelau, the highest peak, which is quite a well-trod kind of route. And then the third one is a kind of multi-day adventure, which I may have been the only Malay who's done this trip. Like, it's quite, so that's more at the adventure end. So to start with, and so that gives you a bit of variety. So these 3 walks, you've got summits, there's hot springs, you've got lakes, you've got some easy stuff, you've got some harder stuff, different kind of durations.
I was going to say, now when you say hot springs, is that sit in there and relax, or is it just something you look at?
I have to say the hot springs are probably more enjoyable in a cold climate, when you get out and it's cold, when you get in and it's hot. When it's already hot and you get into a hot pool, it's not quite as relaxing, but it's still nice and relaxing. So they are natural hot springs. There's 2 of those in Bobonaro, which I'll come on to on the big hike. Those are proper hot springs you can sit in and relax.
All right, so go through the individual hikes then.
Great, thank you. So first one is in Dili, and I call it Tasi Tolu Lakes. So Tasi Tolu is an area of Dili just to the west of the city centre. It's close to the airport. In Teton, the local language, Tasi means sea and Tolu means 3. So it means 3 seas, or basically 3 lakes. So there's 3 lakes, but in the wet season there's 2 lakes because 2 of them merge. And they are it's a special birding area. So it has been noted as one of the best spots in the country for birds. You get a lot of migratory birds depending on the time of year. Often see a lot of gannets and herons, egrets and various sort of birds. So it's good for seeing birds. If you do the walk first thing in the morning, which I always kind of recommend, it's often very still. And so I've had some beautiful, almost perfect reflections, which is very attractive. It's navigationally very easy, and you can get to it using public transport. So in Dili, there are things called microlets, which are the local kind of buses. They cost 25 cents per ride. They've got very good network coverage, and the frequency, you can normally, when you're getting on a microlet, you can normally see the next one behind. Like, if you wait more than 2 minutes for a microlet, something's gone wrong. Like, they're so frequent. The downsides are they're quite small for Malay, because they're more built for sort of Timorese kind of size people, and the drivers tend to play very loud music. So I always take earplugs with me. But anyway, so you can catch the microlet number 10, which goes from the city centre out to Tasi Tolu. Takes about 20 minutes. And then you just basically walk around the lakes, I recommend, in a anti-clockwise direction, because that means you get the most kind of shade. And there's quite a lot of local life as well. So that area was a kind of nature reserve, effectively, up until about 10, 15 years ago. And then a lot of people have moved from, called the district, so the kind of the rest of Timor Leste, moved to the capital, Dili. So Timor population is about 1.3 million people. 300,000 live in Dili. The second biggest city is about 20,000 people. So like Dili is completely different to the rest of the country, and which is kind of interesting from a exploring kind of perspective. And so a lot of people basically moved down to Tasitolu and they built their own houses, and you can imagine it started off pretty basic and now there's more kind of permanent structures. So walking around the lake, very safe, very easy navigationally, and you get to see a bit of local life, the shops and how people live. And so it's just a really relatively straightforward, easy kind of walk to do. So it's about 5 kilometres, probably an hour and a half. That's a good kind of starting point, I'd suggest, for a walk. The second walk is Mount Ramalau. So Mount Ramalau, as I said, the highest peak. It is 2,986 meters high, and it's pretty much in the center of the country. And it is a known walk. So I said earlier there's no infrastructure, but of all the walks, this is the one which is the most walked. And it is a thing that people come to Timor Leste and they go and hike up Mount Ramalau. Generally do it over 2 days. So you would travel out from Dili. The local buses are not great. It's better to do it with a local tour company to get the transport situation. Particularly, there's a sealed road to Mabisi, which is maybe 3 hours from Dili, but from Mabisi to Hatabaliko, which is where the hike starts, it's about an hour, but on some pretty rough roads. Like you need a 4-wheel drive or motorbike to get along them. So that's kind of best done either as a tour, or at least with some organised transport. And then you'd kind of travel out one day, and then people tend to try and go up for sunrise, and then they see the sunrise, and then they come back down and they head back to Dili. So you can do it in about probably even 24 hours elapsed time, but more like take a couple of days to kind of go up there. And a lot of kind of tour itineraries would include a trip to Ramalau. So it's about 9 to 10k return. The tracks are relatively wide and straightforward, but and it probably take anywhere between about 3 to 5 hours return, depending on how your speed kind of going up the hill. Most people though will take a local guide, because if you're going up for sunrise, you're walking in the dark. And although I said the tracks are very straightforward, when I say tracks, there are tracks. Like there's not kind of one path to the summit. There's about 5 different paths to the summit. So it's very easy in the dark, to kind of take the wrong path. But so if you want to get there for sunrise, you need to leave really about 3 o'clock in the morning, 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning. Personally, I haven't done that because I quite like my sleep. So what I did, which is I suggest as a good alternative as well, is you go up for sunset. So I walked up in the kind of mid-afternoon and then came down in the dark and got to see the sunset from there. And the benefit of that was it was a bit warmer because I wasn't hanging around around dawn time. There was almost nobody there. I mean, even at dawn, there's very few people kind of will be at the summit. And if there are other people out there, they're probably going to be locals. So the summit is marked by a statue of the Virgin Mary that was installed it came over from Italy. It was installed by a local priest in 1997. And it's funny because before it was always the summit and the mountain. And then since they've installed this statue of the Virgin Mary, it's become a very popular pilgrimage site. So every year, there's probably about 25,000 people summit Mount Ramalau. But most of those, probably 80 or 90% of those, are around festivals. So there is 2 kind of festivals each year. Off the top of my head, I think it's kind of March and November, celebrating the Virgin Mary. And so there will be thousands of Timorese go up there. They hold an open-air mass. I mean, it'll be quite an interesting cultural experience to go up there for those events. But the vast majority of people go up for those 2 times of the year, and the rest of the year it's pretty quiet. And then you're at the highest point in the country, so the views are pretty good. It can obviously it's a mountain. It can cloud over, especially in the wet season. Visibility can be pretty limited. But in the dry season, and particularly in the morning, you've got a pretty good odds of having kind of clear views, and you can see basically coast to coast. So you can see the entire country. So that's a pretty awesome walk to do. And I'd say that's got a bit more infrastructure and kind of it's a little bit logistically easier to do than some of the others.
All right, so we've got a lake walk near in the city. We've got the summit walk, and what's number 3?
The third one is a real adventure kind of walk. So this is a 42-kilometer hike. It's about 2.5 days of hiking. I think it was about 18 hours worth of actual elapsed time hiking, and then 2 half days of travel, because you've got to drive out for about 5 or 6 hours to get to the start point, and then it's about 5 or 6 hours back from the end point. So this one is called Tapo to Asabi, and you need to do this through a local operator. So Eco Discovery are a Timorese owned tour operator. They're basically the only local operator who, there's probably only about 8 tour operators in Timor in total. All of those will do Mount Ramalau. That's a very kind of known itinerary. The Tatitolu Lake, you don't need a guide for. That's kind of something that you can just kind of do in Dili. But the Tapoto Sabi, or any like the coast to coast from the north coast to south coast 8-day hike, which is amazing as well. Eco Discovery are basically the only people in the country that kind of do those hikes. There is an Australian-owned company called Mad Dog Adventure, and they do a World War II themed hike. So if you're interested in the history, the Sparrow Force were the Australian troops in Timor during World War II when the Japanese invaded, and there's quite interesting history about their battles against the Japanese. So kind of a little bit like if you've done a Kokoda, enjoyed that, this is another kind of potential option. So Mad Dog Adventures run that route, but really Eco Discovery for the rest of kind of the country in terms of hiking, they're the kind of go-to operator. Because you basically need, it's a fully supported hike. And so you have a support vehicle, which is a decent four-wheel drive vehicle, and that will take you to the start, and then it will drive around, as you do hiking during the day, it will drive around to where you're going to camp the next night, and it will carry, because you're trying to get food up in the hills can be quite challenging. If you want anything other than 2-minute noodles, like options are quite limited. Like the shops are quite small, and noodles seems to be the main thing for sale. And even just like getting water supplies, because you can't drink the tap water here, so you need to have kind of potable water. So that's why you have a support vehicle that carries the water and the food. They'll try and buy food locally as they go. They'll get a local chicken, which will be, they'll go get it live from the market and then kill it, and then you have that for dinner. And so you need that kind of support vehicle, and then you have a lead guide and some kind of porters carrying stuff as well for lunch, and also just for safety. It's good to have a few extra kind of people in the crew. So this is a hike I did. So I said we drove out one day down through to Bobonaro. So that's in the sort of western side of the country. You drive actually on that way. You drive through Balibo, where the Balibo 5 happened. And you spend the night in Tapo. And then the next day you hike from Tapo up this, I can't quite pronounce the local name, but this mountain is absolutely beautiful. Honestly, I could be in New Zealand in terms of, it was always literally uncovered forest and beautiful views and really interesting bush and forest, and very kind of quite different to what I'd seen elsewhere in Timor. And then kind of come down quite a long descent into Morobo. Morobo is probably the most famous hot springs in Timor Leste. They were developed originally by the Portuguese. It was a bit of a kind of weekend escape from Dili, and then the Indonesians did some renovations and worked them as well. It's a very Timor Leste thing that they put some money into the infrastructure, so there are kind of, I think, 3 different pools with different temperatures and a little bit of a waterfall set up. But maintenance is not a Timorese strength. So the toilet facilities you don't really want to be using, and there's not a lot of maintenance that's happened there. But you're almost guaranteed to be the only people there, apart from some local kids. They're in a beautiful setting with all these kind of rice fields going down the hillside, and you've got these hot springs, and so it's quite an incredible kind of spot. And so we spend the night there, and then the next day, quite different landscape again. Like when I did the hike in September, it was very, very dry, but amazing kind of views of the surrounding scenery. There's another hot spring we kind of visit, which is very kind of local. They kind of just dug out this kind of, it's a natural hot spring, but they've obviously created a kind of pool around it and more kind of rice fields near there. And then head up to Asabi, which is in Amira, which is the next kind of municipality over. And that's just a beautiful, beautiful views. The temperature up there, it's funny because the locals are always like, oh, it's so cold. But for a Malaya visitor, the temperature is just perfect. You know, it's more like low to mid-20s. It might be in the mid-teens at night. It's just that much more comfortable. So beautiful views and nice camping in Asabi. And then the last day is just a short kind of 2-3 hour walk, and you go to visit the highest waterfall in Timor Leste, which is about 200 meters high. So that's pretty cool to see. And then get back into the support vehicle and then drive back to Dili by the kind of late afternoon. And even, I mean, the driving is part of the experience, because even doing that, you do a pretty decent loop of a decent part of Timor-Leste, and you get to see the variety of landscapes and just like how people live, and it's just quite an interesting kind of experience doing that. So that is, it's not an easy hike by any means. That's definitely the hardest of the three, but that's a real kind of experience, one you'd remember kind of hike.
Okay, that's good. That's a good mix of hikes and a good mix of experiences, depending on whether you're there just for a day or a half day, or whether you're there for a week or so and you've got a bit more time to do something like that. So it sounds like an interesting walk.
It certainly is, yeah. And I'm slightly biased because basically I did a survey. I did this hike as a survey hike with Eco Discovery to kind of work out the route, and I kind of wrote up the itinerary. And if you look on their website or on YouTube under Exploring Timor, like I've made some videos of it, so you can get a bit of a flavour for what to experience. And I guess that's something I'd suggest is if this podcast has whetted your appetite a little bit, then if you look at exploringtimor.com, that's a website I've set up, which I've tried to include everything I know and learned about Timor in the last year, with lots of logistical information, because there wasn't, when I certainly got here, there was very little information about Timor-Leste, and particularly hiking, there was almost zero. So I tried to create this information and share this information. So that website's a good kind of portal in. I've written kind of there's a guidebook I've written, a hiking book, and a few photography books. And then I've also got a TikTok and a YouTube and an Instagram. So, particularly like some of the YouTube videos, the one about that hike I just talked about is maybe 5 or 6 minutes long, and it will just give you, a good kind of idea of what to expect if you want to visit, or it can be a bit hardcore at times. It's interesting just to see what life is like in other countries.
And as a generalisation, is the people friendly and welcoming?
Very much so, yeah. To say tourists are a real kind of novelty, particularly when you get outside of Dili. When I go on my morning walks, even just around Dili. So the local language Teton is a sort of mixture of local and also a bit of Portuguese. So they'll say bon dia. So almost everybody I come across, like you say bon dia, they say bon dia, and then or in the afternoon they say tardi. And so they're very kind of welcoming, and I've had zero issues. It feels very safe. Like I walk by myself, around the city, around the hills, and never felt unsafe or had any issues other than the dogs, because I've got a bit of a phobia of dogs, so I'm kind of learning to manage that. But yeah, very, very safe. Obviously, if you're a female traveller, that's a slightly different kind of risk assessment, but I think just the usual precautions kind of apply. And I've certainly not really heard of any people having issues as solo women kind of travelling around Timor-Leste. If anything, I think a couple of months ago, the Lonely Planet writer, who's an Australian lady, she was hitchhiking by herself around Timor and had no issues. So it is a very kind of safe place. And it doesn't, apart from maybe some taxi drivers, nobody's going to try and rip you off. Like you don't have this thing that you might have in more. Yeah, I felt it a bit when I was in Bali, for example, that if somebody's going to talk to you, they're probably trying to get some money out of you. They're trying to sell you a taxi driver or a massage or something. Whereas here, they're just genuinely kind of interested, because it's a bit of a novelty seeing a Malay, especially up in the hills, kind of doing these things. Okay,
that's good. Regarding gear, I know Dili's a reasonably good-sized city, but I can't imagine there's a multitude of hiking and outdoor stores there, but I could be wrong. Do hikers need to pretty much bring everything with them, or if they do lose something or forget something, can they pick it up there?
Bring everything with you, maybe a spare, is what I'd suggest. Like There are zero outdoor hiking stores in Timor Leste. I mean, there's only one cinema in the entire country, and there's only one shopping mall in the whole country. So I did find somewhere that did sell hiking poles, not very good ones, they're about $10 US. Hydrolytes, you can pick up from a local pharmacy. That's kind of fine. You might be able to get some cheap umbrellas, but anything, your normal, your hiking gear in terms of kind of boots and pack and all that stuff, definitely kind of bring with you, and maybe a spare pair of shoelaces, or some super glue. It's amazing what you can do with your shoes and a pair of some super glue if anything goes wrong. So, I'd come self-sufficient.
Okay. Now, one final question. What's your next great hiking adventure?
Hopefully, I will be going to Ladakh in August this year. So that's the Indian part of the Himalaya. I have visited there before, but not hiking. It's quite, it's culturally very interesting because there's a lot. It's basically Tibetan Buddhism, so it's almost more authentic Tibetan Buddhism than what you get to see in China, given what's happening in Tibet. So it's fascinating monasteries and things there. And there's a hike called the Sky Trail, which is run by the Mountain Company, which I've done all my hikes in the Himalayas with. Highly recommend them, the Mountain Company. And it's probably about 3 to 4 weeks long. So it's a decent hike. And I think it's something I came across like 10 or 15 years ago. And I've always had it at the back of my mind that I'd like to do it. And so that I'm hopefully going to do later this year.
Okay, no, that's good. That's good. Okay, so we've been talking with Jonty Crane about hiking in Timor-Leste. Jonty, thanks for taking your time to fill us in on this undiscovered destination.
Thank you for having me. Hopefully this has at least raised a bit of awareness about what is possible just an hour's flight from Australia.
So that was our interview with Jonty Crane on hiking in Timor-Leste. The links or the businesses that Jonty was talking about through the interview, if you go to the show notes for this podcast 307, we'll have the links to those and also to Jonty's website as well for more information, as well as links to the books for hiking in Timor-Leste on Amazon, just to give you an idea. And we'll be doing some reviews of those in the coming weeks. As I said in the start of this interview, ask someone to name some hikes in Timor-Leste, or in fact, ask someone to point out Timor-Leste on a map. They might know that it's sort of somewhere north of Australia, but they'd probably be hard-pressed to find it without spending a bit of time looking for it. And certainly from an Australian perspective, I'm aware of Timor-Leste because of all the problems and the invasion, but really that's all I knew about it. So we did spend a bit of time in this episode talking about Timor-Leste in general, and I now have a better idea of what the country is like that I didn't before.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one because, you know, it sounds from the description that Jonty gave that in a very short time it's become, you know, a very nice place to visit and some great opportunities for some really interesting hiking, but also some cultural experiences as well. And I think you also said at the beginning that it isn't necessarily the first on the list for anybody looking at an overseas hike.
I think as an overall comment, for me, this is a bit of an undiscovered country. You know, most people will know about many hikes all over the world, about the big hiking destinations. But if you're looking for something out of the norm, something a bit more remote and something you can do a bit of exploring in, or have someone lead you on particularly some of the more complex walks, this is probably not a bad country to head to.
It definitely is wilderness. It definitely is create your own adventure. I was comforted by the fact that there are guides that you can use and that can show you the way and show you the best, particularly if you don't have a lot of time. But I was also a little bit sort of, you know, it is very much undiscovered wilderness in a Western sense, and you know, you can't rely on the usual sorts of things that you would if you were organising an overseas hike.
One thing I hadn't thought about is the highest mountain in Timor-Leste is roughly around about 3,000 metres. And when you compare that to Mount Kosciuszko at give or take 2,400 metres, it's higher than that. Mm-hmm. But you're looking at a country that is a fifth the size of the state of Tasmania or the island of Tasmania. And, it's you've got this very large mountain in relation.
It would dominate, wouldn't it?
Would dominate compared to the size of the actual country itself. There sounds like there's some good variety of hiking there. You've got the Lake Walk, which Jonty identified. You've got the Mount Ramallah, which is a summit walk. And then you've got the multi-day walk that Jonty helped sort of coordinate or help put together that people are starting to do. So there's plenty of variety there in a population that seems at this stage still glad to see tourists. It hasn't got to the stage of Bali, where there's millions of people that go there each year, and people are still keen to see tourists and still very friendly as well.
I think that's true, and I think we need to be mindful of that and respect that as well, because we've seen what's happened in other places of the world, and how an influx of tourists can be such a great thing, but also be such a negative thing as well.
I suppose the final thing I'd say through here is this is very much a cultural experience as well as a hiking experience. You're getting to come across a relatively new nation, 2002 from memory, Jonty was saying. So it really hasn't been a standalone country in recent times at least. And it's a variety of terrains. You've got the big city in Dili, which is a population of roughly 300,000. You've got smaller little locations and a lot of urban stuff. And Jonty was actually doing some urban hiking and going through or trying to go through all the urban areas before he left. And I think he's by now he's either left or he's very close to leaving and heading back to New Zealand for his real life, I suppose. He's finished his stint or just about to finish his stint there. So I think if you're looking for something a bit out of the norm, something where you can do a bit of a choose-your-own adventure that thousands and thousands of people haven't already done before, this is certainly a good opportunity to do it.
It is a good opportunity, and it's also great to see someone like Jonty with such a wealth of hiking experience volunteering in a nation around tourism and around the hiking and exploring and, showing the rest of the world what it has to offer.
Okay, we hope you've enjoyed this taste of Timor Leste, a bit of an undiscovered country. That's all for me. Bye for now.
And bye from me.